Charlotte was handpicked to marry the richest guy in the city. We're talking power, fame, and a life everyone dreams about. But how in the hell she doesn't want it? What if all that money and luxury isn't enough to satisfy her? What if just like that, she walks away from it all? No, seriously, she does it. And the craziest part? This isn't just about love, it's about something else. But can she really escape the life everyone expects her to live? You won't believe what happens next. I'm your host, Josh, and it's an absolute pleasure to share this story with you. Charlotte Evans sat on the edge of her worn sofa, her phone resting in her lap, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. The small apartment around her, filled with mismatched furniture and fading photographs, had always been her sanctuary. It was simple, but it was hers. Yet at this moment, it felt as though the walls were closing in. She glanced at the email again, the one blinking on the screen in front of her. The subject line, "Congratulations, you've been selected for the 2025 Love Lottery," seemed to mock her as it glared back at her. She had received dozens of these over the years, invitations that practically screamed, "You're the chosen one." But this one was different, because it was her. She was the one who had been selected, the Love Lottery, a tradition that had been around for decades. The city's most eligible men, billionaires, moguls, the powerful, picked a woman to marry, chosen from a pool of hopefuls. It wasn't about love, it wasn't about connection. It was about creating the perfect image, a marriage between wealth, status, and public approval. It was the ultimate prize, one Charlotte had never wanted. Her mother had practically begged her to enter. "This is your chance, Charlotte. This could change everything for you." But Charlotte had always refused. She had no interest in becoming a prize to be displayed on a pedestal, to be paraded around like an accessory to someone else's empire. She wanted real love, not a transaction dressed up as a fairy tale. But as she stared at the email now, everything felt different. The weight of her mother's pleas echoed in her mind. "You'll regret this if you don't enter, darling. Think of the future. Think of all the opportunities." Charlotte's finger hovered over the accept button. She thought about her life, her quiet, unremarkable life, the same one she'd been living since she was a child. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. It was full of simple pleasures, long walks in the park, late-night phone calls with her best friend, the feeling of freedom in choosing her own path. But it also came with limitations. She was struggling. Her job was uninspiring, her rent was overdue, and her dreams always felt just out of reach. Maybe, just maybe, the lottery would give her a chance to live a life she had never dared to imagine. With a deep breath, Charlotte clicked the button. The next few days were a blur of excitement and anticipation. Her name was everywhere. News outlets, social media, even her co-workers couldn't stop talking about her. She had won. She was the lucky one. Everyone seemed to have an opinion on it, but Charlotte felt numb. People congratulated her, her mother gushed about how proud she was, and the city buzzed with excitement. But Charlotte didn't feel lucky. She felt suffocated. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't a dream come true. It was a nightmare. 2 days later, Charlotte found herself at the extravagant lottery draw event, watching the faces of the men who would be choosing their brides. The stage was set for a spectacle, a carefully orchestrated event that would end in one woman's life being altered forever. Charlotte's life. She couldn't look away as the host, a polished man with too much charisma, introduced the men, the city's wealthiest, most influential bachelors. They were men of power, men who had built their fortunes through blood, sweat, and control. And now, they would choose their wives, not based on love, but on what they could bring to the table. Charlotte's stomach churned as the names were called. And then, it happened. The host's voice boomed. "And now, the moment you've all been waiting for. The winner of the 2025 Love Lottery. The woman who will marry none other than the one and only Alex Montgomery." Charlotte's heart stopped. Her palms went clammy. Her breath caught in her throat. The camera flashed to Alex Montgomery, the man who seemed to own everything. Tall, commanding, with sharp aristocratic features that made him look like a character straight out of a business textbook. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the crowd as if everything was beneath him. His smile didn't reach his eyes. There was no warmth there, just an aura of detachment and control. Alex Montgomery, the heir to Montgomery Enterprises, a man whose wealth and power were unmatched in the city, a man who had everything a person could want, and more. Charlotte felt the walls close in on her. She had won a lottery, yes, but she had won a life she didn't want. She wasn't excited. She wasn't happy. She was terrified. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind again. Only this time, it wasn't just an echo. It was a suffocating whisper, urging her to accept this fate, to embrace the life that had been handed to her. This is it, darling. This is your chance to live the life you deserve. But was this the life she deserved? A life of appearances? A life where love was nothing more than an accessory? Charlotte Evans. The host's voice was a distant sound now, as if it were coming from underwater. Will marry Alex Montgomery, the heir to Montgomery Enterprises. The camera zoomed in on Alex, his face now plastered with that same cold, impassive smile. He didn't look like someone who had just won the lottery. He looked like someone who was used to taking whatever he wanted. And now, Charlotte was part of that. She was just another prize to be displayed, another woman in a long line of others. The applause from the crowd was deafening, and Charlotte's breath came in shallow gasps as the reality of it all settled in. This was it. Her future, decided by a lottery, by fate. No say, no choice. Her mother called immediately, practically shrieking with joy. "Charlotte, darling, do you realize what this means? You've won. You're going to marry Alex Montgomery. Do you know what this could do for us?" Charlotte pressed her hand to her forehead, fighting the urge to scream. I didn't choose this, she thought, but she couldn't say it. She couldn't express the growing sense of dread that was consuming her. "I know, Mom," she whispered. "I know." But she didn't know. She didn't know what would come next. She didn't know how she was supposed to feel. And most of all, she didn't know how she was supposed to live a life that wasn't hers. Charlotte stood outside Montgomery Enterprises, the towering glass building casting long shadows over the streets as the sun dipped behind it. The city felt different today. Quieter, more suffocating. She had entered the lottery reluctantly, but now that she was here, about to meet the man she would marry, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in her life. Her mother had been beside herself with excitement, practically dragging Charlotte to the event. "This is your moment, Charlotte, the moment you've been waiting for." But Charlotte didn't feel like it was her moment. It was as though her life had been handed to her, a neatly wrapped package with a ribbon she hadn't chosen. She felt like a bystander in her own story. The lobby of Montgomery Enterprises was everything she had imagined and more. High ceilings, polished marble floors, and walls adorned with abstract art that screamed wealth and power. The soft hum of conversation was drowned out by the sound of her heels clicking against the floor as she followed the assistant down the long hallway to Alex's office. She couldn't help but feel out of place, her simple dress seeming inadequate among the polished suits and designer attire around her. "Miss Evans," the assistant said, holding open the door to Alex's office. "Mr. Montgomery is expecting you." Charlotte's heart raced in her chest. She hadn't been this nervous since her first job interview years ago, back when she was fresh out of college, eager to make her mark in the world. But this was different. There was no job interview. There was no choice. This was fate. The door opened, and Charlotte stepped inside. Alex Montgomery stood by the window, looking out at the city below. His profile was sharp, his posture straight, exuding an aura of control and command. The city, his city, was his empire, and Charlotte was about to be a part of it. She wasn't sure if that was a dream or a nightmare. He didn't turn around as she entered, and Charlotte stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. His back was straight, his suit tailored to perfection, his dark hair combed back in a way that seemed to say, "I don't care about appearances, but everything about me is perfect." "Miss Evans," Alex said, his voice smooth and even, but there was something unsettling about the way he spoke. "Please, sit." Charlotte hesitated before sitting across from him. The silence in the room was thick, like a pressure building in her chest. She had expected this meeting to be formal. After all, this was a business arrangement, not a fairy tale. But she hadn't expected it to feel so cold. "I trust everything has been prepared for the announcement?" Alex asked, finally turning to face her. His piercing blue eyes met hers, studying her as if she were a problem to be solved. Charlotte nodded, unsure of how to answer. Prepared? She wasn't prepared for any of this, but she wasn't sure if she was allowed to say that. "I assume you've been briefed on the nature of our engagement," he continued, his tone businesslike, detached. "There are appearances to maintain, Miss Evans. We can't afford to look like anything less than the perfect couple. Public appearances, charity events, those will be your responsibilities. I, of course, will take care of the business side of things." Charlotte swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. "I understand," she managed, but the words felt hollow as they left her mouth. She had never been a fan of appearances, of living a life dictated by the public's expectations, but she wasn't sure how to challenge this. This was her reality now. Alex moved toward his desk and sat down, continuing with the cold, calculated discussion of their upcoming public appearances. Charlotte could barely follow. If you are enjoying the story, help us by subscribing to the channel. And please leave a comment to let us know what you're thinking about the story. This is of huge importance to us. Her mind was swimming with thoughts of what she had just agreed to. She had wanted out of the lottery system, out of the life of wealth and spectacle that had consumed her. But here she was, sitting in front of the man who would become her husband. A man who seemed to care more about the image they would project than the life they would share. She wasn't even sure if he cared about her as a person. He was everything she had feared. A man of business, not of love. A man who was too consumed by his empire to see her as anything other than a piece in his game. When he finished speaking, Charlotte felt an emptiness fill the space between them. The man before her was a stranger. He wasn't her partner. He wasn't her confidant. He was her future in name only. For a moment, she considered leaving. Could she just walk away? Could she find a way out of this arrangement? This marriage of convenience that was supposed to save her from a life of struggle? But she couldn't. She had already signed the papers. Her life had already been decided for her. "Is there anything else you'd like to discuss, Miss Evans?" Alex asked, his voice cutting through her thoughts. Charlotte snapped back to the present, her mind still reeling. "No, Mr. Montgomery. I believe we've covered everything." He nodded, clearly satisfied, and stood up. "Good. I trust you'll be ready for the upcoming events. The media will be watching, of course. We can't afford any slip-ups." Charlotte felt a wave of nausea rise in her chest. This wasn't a partnership. This wasn't love. This was a performance. As she stood to leave, Alex didn't offer her any words of encouragement. No reassurance, no gestures of warmth. His cold gaze remained fixed on her as she turned to exit, as though she was just another task on his to-do list. Another thing to manage. Another image to project. She stepped out of the office, the door clicking shut behind her. For the first time, she let herself feel the weight of what she had agreed to. The life she had always dreamed of was slipping further away, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to accept this new reality. Was this what she wanted? Was this really the life she had dreamed of? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she didn't check it. She didn't need to. She already knew what her mother would say. The days after her first official meeting with Alex Montgomery were a blur of activity and media frenzy. Charlotte had expected the whirlwind of attention. After all, the lottery and her engagement to one of the wealthiest men in the city was the headline everyone was talking about. What she hadn't expected was how quickly it all would feel like a performance. Every moment of her life, from public appearances to personal conversations, had been reduced to something she had to manage. The press was relentless, and the constant stream of reporters, photographers, and flashing cameras felt like a pressure cooker that never let up. But nothing made her feel more like an actor in someone else's story than the upcoming gala they were attending. This event was supposed to solidify their image. Charlotte and Alex Montgomery, the new power couple. The evening of the gala arrived faster than she could process. Charlotte stood in front of the mirror in her apartment, adjusting the gown she had been given for the occasion. It was beautiful, sapphire blue, elegant, designed to make her stand out. But she didn't feel beautiful. She felt like a doll being dressed up for display. The weight of the diamonds around her neck felt like a constant reminder of how little her real self mattered in this world. She wasn't Charlotte Evans anymore. She was the future wife of Alex Montgomery, a title she had never wanted. Her mother had been beside herself with excitement. "You're going to be the talk of the city, darling," she had said earlier, practically bouncing around the apartment. "You're marrying Alex Montgomery. You'll be a queen in this town." But Charlotte didn't feel like a queen. She felt like a pawn in a game of wealth, power, and expectations. And tonight was the culmination of that game. "Ready?" her mother asked, bursting into the room with a wide smile. Charlotte met her gaze in the mirror, forcing a smile in return. "Ready as I'll ever be," she replied. As they arrived at the gala, Charlotte was immediately swept up in the overwhelming chaos. The event was being held in a grand ballroom, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city's skyline. The chandeliers sparkled like stars, casting soft golden light over the sea of perfectly dressed men and women. Everyone here had a part to play, Charlotte included. She walked down the red carpet, her mother by her side, the flashing cameras blinding her as they captured every step. The The voices of reporters and photographers calling out to her, asking questions about her future with Alex, felt surreal. It was all a performance. Her life had become a spectacle, and there he was, standing at the top of the staircase. Alex Montgomery, the man she was supposed to marry. His figure was tall and imposing, his face set in that familiar, distant expression she had come to associate with him. He was already surrounded by a group of businessmen, all eager to speak with him. Charlotte's stomach fluttered, but not with excitement. It was more like a tightening knot of uncertainty, of discomfort. When Alex finally turned to see her approaching, there was no warmth in his eyes, no smile, no sense of connection, just that same cold, calculating look. He stepped forward, extending his hand as though it were all a formality, his lips pressing together in a practiced smile. "Miss Evans," he said, his voice cool and collected, "you look perfect." Charlotte took his hand, her fingers trembling slightly despite her best efforts to hide it. "Thank you," she said, forcing the words out, though they felt empty. "Shall we?" Alex asked, already leading her into the crowd, the conversation flowing effortlessly around them. But it wasn't really a conversation. It was more like a performance, a rehearsed act where the lines had already been written. They moved through the ballroom, exchanging pleasantries with investors and socialites, attending to their duties as the city's new golden couple. Charlotte found herself nodding and smiling, doing everything she was expected to do, but inside, she was barely there. Every time Alex spoke, every time his hand brushed against hers, it felt like she was more and more distanced from herself. She wasn't Charlotte Evans anymore. She wasn't a person with hopes and dreams. She was just an image, an accessory. It wasn't until they found themselves standing by a large glass window overlooking the city that Charlotte felt a flicker of something more real. Alex was speaking with a group of men, his back turned to her, when she caught the briefest glimpse of someone standing across the room. A man, not part of the glittering crowd, but standing alone near the edge of the ballroom. His dark hair was a little tousled, his black suit understated in comparison to the polished perfection of the men around him. But it wasn't his clothes that caught Charlotte's attention. It was the way he stood, composed, yet detached, as if he was observing the world, not participating in it. When their eyes met, Charlotte felt an electric jolt in her chest. There was something familiar in the way he looked at her, as though he had been waiting for this moment, waiting for her to notice him. For a second, she didn't know what to do. The man was so different from everything she had been trained to care about. He didn't have power, he didn't have money, but there was something about him that made her feel seen. Just as quickly, he turned away, disappearing into the crowd. But Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling. Her heart beat faster, her thoughts racing. Who was he? What was it about him that made her feel so drawn to him? Charlotte? She turned to find Alex standing beside her, his brow furrowed. "Everything all right?" "Yeah," she replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess." Alex nodded, though his gaze was distant. "We need to keep up appearances. Let's make our rounds, shall we?" Charlotte nodded mechanically, trying to push the feeling of curiosity and something more away. But it lingered. That connection, that man, he was a mystery she couldn't quite unravel. Charlotte couldn't escape the buzz in the air, the constant hum of the city, even as she sat quietly in her apartment the following evening. She had just returned from the gala, still reeling from the endless handshakes, the polite but hollow conversations, and the weight of Alex's presence at her side. She had worn the role of future wife like a tight, uncomfortable gown, perfect, yet suffocating. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, but she didn't reach for it. She could already feel the tension building between her and Alex. He had barely said a word to her during their drive back. The awkward silence had been deafening. She knew their public appearances were a part of the game. But tonight, for the first time, she felt the full weight of what she had signed up for. She had expected a partnership, a mutual understanding, something that would at least make this transition bearable. Instead, she felt like an accessory, a piece of his empire to be showcased. Her thoughts were interrupted when her mother called. Charlotte hesitated for a moment before answering, knowing full well that her mother would be thrilled to hear about the evening's success. "Charlotte, darling," her mother's voice rang through the phone, practically vibrating with excitement. "I saw the pictures. You two looked perfect together. The press is already buzzing about you and Alex. This is going to be everything we've dreamed of." Charlotte took a deep breath. "Yeah, everything went fine," she said, trying to sound convincing. "Oh, don't be so modest," her mother gushed. "This is the moment we've been waiting for." Alex Montgomery is your future, and you're going to live a life most people only dream of. This is just the beginning, sweetheart. Charlotte closed her eyes, feeling the heaviness of her mother's words. This was everything she had been warned about. The expectations, the pressure, the constant need to keep up appearances. She had never wanted this life, and yet, here she was, walking this path with no way to turn back. "I know, Mom," Charlotte said quietly, the words feeling hollow in her mouth. "But I can't help but feel..." "Feel what?" her mother interrupted. "You have everything now. Don't waste it." Charlotte's heart sank. She wanted to argue, to tell her mother that this wasn't her dream, that she didn't care about the wealth and status, but she knew better. Her mother wouldn't understand. "I just want to make sure this is right," Charlotte said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a long silence on the other end. "You don't have time to second-guess this, Charlotte. This is your future. This is how the world works." Her mother's words stung, and Charlotte hung up shortly after, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The life she had just stepped into was a gilded cage, beautiful and shiny, but suffocating all the same. The wealth, the status, the attention, all of it was nothing compared to the love she had always longed for. But love, real love, wasn't part of this world. At least, not in any way she could see. Later that evening, she found herself standing at the window of her apartment, staring out at the city below. The lights of the skyline shimmered like stars, but they only made her feel more alone. The life she had left behind, the one that had been simple, filled with real connections, felt like a distant memory. Her phone buzzed again, and this time, she picked it up. The message was from Alex. "We need to discuss the upcoming charity event. Can you be at my place tomorrow at 10 a.m.? She sighed, setting the phone down. There was no warmth in his words, just the cold efficiency of business. That was all he seemed to care about. Appearances, power, control. At 10 a.m., sharp, Charlotte found herself walking into Alex's penthouse, a place that felt as cold and imposing as he did. The glass walls stretched high above her, giving her an expansive view of the city that Alex seemed to own. She couldn't help but feel small in this world. Alex greeted her as though they had just stepped into another business meeting, his voice curt, his smile practiced. "Good morning, Miss Evans. I trust you're doing well?" "I'm fine," Charlotte replied, her voice tight. She hadn't yet found the courage to confront him about how she felt, about how much this whole thing was suffocating her. But the longer she spent in this world, the more she realized it wasn't just the spotlight or the expectations that bothered her. It was him. Alex's tone shifted, more businesslike now. "We need to focus on the upcoming events. The charity gala is a huge opportunity for us, for our image. It's about more than just giving. It's about creating the right public perception." Charlotte nodded, though inside, she felt a pang of frustration. Was this what her life had become? A series of calculated moves designed to maintain the image of perfection? "I understand," she said, trying to keep her voice even. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that understanding didn't mean agreeing. Alex didn't notice her hesitation as he continued. "The media will be there. We'll need to look unified, engaged. You'll need to be involved in the charity work. The press loves a good cause, and it's good for our brand." Charlotte clenched her fists, her heart racing with irritation. A brand. That's what she was. A brand. Not a person. Not a woman who longed for real connection. Just another asset in Alex's empire. "I'll do my part," she said, her voice stiff. "Good," Alex replied, turning his attention to his tablet, as though their conversation was already over. For a moment, Charlotte stood there, feeling the weight of his indifference pressing down on her. This wasn't love. This wasn't partnership. This was business. As she left his penthouse later, her mind was heavy with the realization that this was the life she had chosen, whether she liked it or not. But as she stepped into the elevator and the doors closed with a soft whoosh, she made a decision. She wasn't going to let this be her life. She wasn't going to let Alex or anyone else define her future. She would find a way out, no matter the cost. The elevator descended, and Charlotte felt the pull of the world she had once known. Maybe there was a way to get it back. Maybe there was a way to find real love, to find herself again. But for now, she had to play the part. She had to pretend, and pretend she did, all the way home. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of events, media coverage, and charity galas. Charlotte had become a familiar face in the society pages, her image constantly paired with Alex's in headlines about their engagement. The city watched as the perfect couple made their rounds at exclusive parties, always smiling, always flawless. But inside, Charlotte felt as though she were losing herself. Every time she stood beside Alex at one of these events, her heart grew heavier. The public eye was on them constantly, but there was nothing real about it. She was just a figure in his grand design, a carefully placed accessory to enhance his status. The distance between her and Alex was widening with each passing day, and no matter how hard she tried to pretend it didn't bother her, it did. Tonight, however, was different. Charlotte had been invited to an art gallery opening, another event to keep up appearances, but this one seemed more tolerable than the others. The art itself was a temporary escape from the shallow world she had been thrust into. For the first time in a while, she found herself looking forward to it. The gallery was one of the most exclusive in the city, filled with masterpieces from the most renowned contemporary artists. Charlotte felt out of place, surrounded by wealth and sophistication. As much as she tried to remind herself that she was part of this world now, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was an outsider, an actress in a play she hadn't agreed to perform in. Her mother had insisted she attend, of course, as always. "It's important, darling. You need to look engaged. The world is watching." As Charlotte entered the gallery, she was immediately greeted by a sea of well-dressed socialites and businessmen, all discussing the latest trends in art and their investments in the pieces on display. She felt an odd sense of detachment from it all. To these people, art was just another asset, another thing to buy and sell. It didn't matter to them what the art represented, only its price tag. She made her way through the crowd, trying to look interested in the paintings and sculptures, but her mind kept drifting back to her reality, the life she was now living, the life that didn't feel like her own. She had tried so hard to be present, to play the role of the perfect fiancé, but it was becoming harder by the day. It wasn't until she found herself in front of one particular piece, a striking black and white photograph of an empty street at night, that her thoughts began to clear. The photograph was haunting, beautiful in its simplicity, and for the first time in a long time, Charlotte felt something stir inside her. The image of emptiness, of solitude, struck a chord deep within her. It was as if the artist had captured the exact feeling she had been suppressing for so long. The emptiness of her own life, the isolation that came with being surrounded by people who didn't truly see her. As she stared at the photograph, she didn't notice someone approaching. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Charlotte turned, startled, and found herself looking into the eyes of a man she hadn't noticed before. He was standing just a few feet away, his dark eyes intense, his casual attire a stark contrast to the polished, extravagant outfits of the other guests. He smiled at her, and there was something about his smile, warm, genuine, that immediately put her at ease. It was unexpected in a room filled with people more interested in networking than connecting. "Yes," Charlotte said, her voice softer than she intended. "It's haunting." The man nodded, his gaze lingering on the photograph before meeting her eyes again. "It captures loneliness in a way most people would never understand. The empty street, it's like a metaphor for everything that's missing in our lives." Charlotte blinked, surprised by how deeply he spoke. I didn't think about it that way," she admitted. "But now that you mention it, it feels like a reflection of the emptiness I sometimes feel." The man studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "It's not easy, is it? Being surrounded by all this wealth, power, status, and still feeling empty inside." Charlotte's breath caught in her chest. There was something in his voice, in the way he spoke, that resonated with her more than she cared to admit. How did he know exactly what she was feeling? "No," she said quietly. "It's not." He smiled again, his eyes kind, as if he could see through her carefully crafted exterior. "I'm Ethan," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "Charlotte," she said, shaking his hand, surprised by how much warmth his touch conveyed. They stood there for a moment, an awkward silence stretching between them. Charlotte felt an odd sense of familiarity with this stranger, someone who didn't know her life, didn't know her role in it, but seemed to understand the emptiness that lay beneath the surface. "You don't belong here, do you?" Ethan asked after a beat, his voice almost a whisper, as if he were letting her in on a secret. Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. She had been in so many situations where she had pretended to belong, but with Ethan she felt no need to fake it. "No," she admitted. "I don't." He nodded, as if he'd known that all along. "Neither do I." There was something about him, something in the way he spoke, the way he saw her, that felt different from everything else in this world. He wasn't here for the wealth or the status. He wasn't here to play the game. Charlotte didn't know what it was about him, but she felt drawn to him in a way she couldn't explain. He wasn't a part of this world, but in that moment, neither was she. "I should probably get back to the crowd," she said, suddenly feeling self-conscious again. Ethan gave her a small, understanding smile. "I'll let you go. But it was nice talking to you, Charlotte. You should try to find more moments like this, where you can just be yourself." For the first time in a long time, Charlotte felt a flicker of something hopeful in her chest. It was as if, in that brief conversation, Ethan had reminded her of something she had forgotten, something real. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "I'll keep that in mind." As she walked away, returning to the crowd, Charlotte felt the weight of the event press down on her again. But this time, there was a small spark of defiance, of possibility, that she hadn't felt before. Ethan's words had given her a glimpse of what it might feel like to be truly free, to not live for anyone but herself. For the first time in a long time, Charlotte felt like she could breathe. The following days felt like a blur to Charlotte. She couldn't stop thinking about the conversation with Ethan. It had been brief, only a few minutes really, but something about him had stuck with her. He was like a reminder of everything she had been missing: genuine connection, authenticity, and someone who actually saw her. Not just the future wife of a billionaire, not just another asset in a carefully constructed empire. The weight of her engagement to Alex felt heavier now, each passing moment more suffocating than the last. She had been playing this part for so long, but the cracks in the facade were starting to show. The more she saw Alex, the more she realized how little they had in common. He was driven, successful, cold, and while she admired his accomplishments, she couldn't ignore the growing distance between them. Charlotte had always imagined that when she found someone, it would be with the kind of deep connection she had seen in the few rare moments between her parents. Real love. Not an arrangement, not something orchestrated for the public eye. But Alex, with his perfect smile and flawless business persona, didn't seem to believe in real love. To him, everything was a strategy, a business deal. The gala, the charity events, the press. It was all part of the plan, and Charlotte had been cast in the role of the perfect fiancé. That evening, they were due to attend another high-profile event, a fundraiser for a new initiative that Alex was spearheading. Charlotte had been expected to show up, look stunning, and be by his side while he made his speeches. It was simple, really, the kind of thing she had done so many times before. But today, her mind wasn't on the event or the people they would meet. It was on Ethan. After their brief exchange at the gallery, she couldn't shake the pull she felt toward him. There was something real in his words, something different. He had made her feel like she wasn't invisible in this world she had been thrust into. He didn't see her as the future Mrs. Montgomery. He saw her as Charlotte. And for the first time in a long time, Charlotte had allowed herself to consider the possibility that she could be someone else, someone with agency, someone who wasn't just playing a role. The thought terrified her. But as she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the neckline of the designer gown that Alex had chosen for the event, she couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. She wasn't Charlotte Evans anymore. She was Charlotte Montgomery, the woman to whom everything had been handed, the life of privilege, the endless parties, the status. But she wasn't happy. She looked at herself in the mirror again. The gown was stunning, elegant, luxurious, everything she had been trained to wear. The diamonds around her neck were worth more than most people's yearly salaries. She was the picture of perfection, but it didn't feel real. She didn't feel real. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts, and her mother's voice called out from the hallway. "Charlotte, darling, are you ready? The car is waiting." Charlotte took a deep breath and smoothed down the front of her dress. It wasn't like she had any other choice. She was expected to go, to play her part. The sooner she did, the sooner she could escape back to the safety of her apartment and try to forget that she felt like a stranger in her own life. When she arrived at the event with Alex, the same cold, polished routine ensued. The flashing cameras, the reporters, the endless smiles and small talk. It all felt like a well-rehearsed performance. Alex was charming and efficient, as always, but Charlotte felt like an accessory to his success. His words never strayed from the script. "We're so proud to be here tonight, to support a cause that's close to our hearts." But there was no passion in his voice, no connection, just words. The night dragged on, the surface-level conversations and polite applause taking their toll on Charlotte. She had been smiling for what felt like hours, pretending to enjoy the endless interactions. The excitement of the gala, the glitz and glamour, had worn off long ago. She had become numb to it all, but tonight, something was different. The weight of her choices was heavier than ever. "Are you all right?" Alex asked, his voice low as they walked through the crowd. "You're awfully quiet tonight." Charlotte glanced up at him, but her gaze felt distant. "I'm fine," she said. though she wasn't sure if she was convincing herself or him. She didn't want to discuss how she felt. She didn't want to tell him that this life wasn't what she had imagined, that she was suffocating in a gilded cage. The night went on, but Charlotte found herself growing more restless. As the event wound down, she stepped outside to get some fresh air. The cool night breeze hit her skin like a jolt of reality. For the first time that evening, she felt awake. As she leaned against the railing of the terrace, her thoughts drifted back to Ethan. What was it about him that made her feel seen, that made her feel real, when everything else in her life felt like a facade? Before she could ponder it further, she heard a voice from behind her. "You're alone out here." Charlotte turned, her heart skipping a beat. Standing there, not far from her, was Ethan. He was dressed simply in a dark suit, looking just as out of place in this world of opulence and pretense as she felt. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them seemed to fade away, and Charlotte felt as if time had stopped. It was just the two of them, standing there in the cool night air. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said, her voice almost a whisper. Ethan smiled, his expression warm, kind. "I didn't expect to be here either, but it's hard to resist a good cause, especially when it's this much of a spectacle." Charlotte chuckled softly, grateful for his humor. It felt like a breath of fresh air in a room that had grown increasingly suffocating. "You're different from everyone else here," Charlotte said before she could stop herself. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That's probably because I'm not interested in pretending." Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. His words, simple, direct, hit her harder than she expected. For a moment, they just stood there in silence, the connection between them undeniable. Ethan wasn't part of this world of wealth and power, and neither was she. "You're not like the others," Charlotte said softly. "You make it seem so easy to be real." Ethan stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's not easy, but it's worth it." Charlotte felt a stir in her chest, something she hadn't felt in a long time. The truth, raw, unfiltered, seemed to be standing right in front of her, and she couldn't ignore it. "I don't belong here," she confessed, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "None of this feels real." Ethan's gaze softened, understanding in his eyes. "Then it's time to find somewhere that does." Charlotte stood there, her heart pounding. This wasn't just a fleeting moment. This was something more, something real. The days following the gala passed in a haze for Charlotte. She couldn't shake the image of Ethan standing across from her on the terrace, his quiet confidence a stark contrast to the world of opulence and appearances she was drowning in. For the first time in months, she felt like she had seen something real, something that wasn't about wealth, status, or public perception. It was a glimpse of freedom, a reminder that there was more to life than the suffocating expectations she was living under. But there was still the reality she had to face. She was engaged to Alex Montgomery, the man the world saw as the epitome of success, the perfect partner. At least, that's what everyone said. But Charlotte wasn't sure who Alex was anymore. He had become a stranger in her life, a man who spoke in calculated tones, a man who expected her to play a part in a grand performance that neither of them had written. She didn't know what it was about Ethan that had made her feel so different, so seen, but she couldn't stop thinking about him. The more Charlotte thought about it, the more she realized just how much she had been pretending. She had spent years pretending to be the woman Alex wanted, the woman her mother had always dreamed of. But who was she really? Who was the woman she wanted to be? She had no answers, but what she did know was that the life she was leading wasn't hers. It wasn't authentic. It wasn't real. The tension between her and Alex had been growing for days, the space between them expanding with each interaction. He no longer even seemed interested in their engagement beyond its public image. She had become a symbol, not a partner. He was always focused on the next business deal, the next event, the next thing that would keep his empire expanding. But what about her? The question gnawed at her as she sat in her apartment, staring at the invitation for the upcoming charity event. It was another mandatory appearance, another night where she would be paraded in front of the press, playing the perfect fiancé. Charlotte hadn't spoken to Alex about how she felt. She couldn't. She was afraid of what it would mean if she did. Would he understand? Would he care? Or would he simply dismiss her concerns as irrelevant, as he always had? She couldn't stay silent any longer. She needed to say something. She needed to take control of her own life again. The evening of the charity event arrived. As usual, Alex was already dressed and waiting when Charlotte entered the living room. His sharp suit and crisp white shirt were perfectly tailored, a visual representation of the cold perfection he so desperately maintained. Charlotte, on the other hand, stood in the doorway, her mind racing. She didn't feel like playing the part anymore. She didn't want to wear the gown, the makeup, the smile that everyone expected. She wanted to be real. Alex turned to her with that same polite smile, but there was nothing behind it. No warmth, no recognition, just the same carefully curated face he presented to the world. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Charlotte nodded, though her heart felt heavy. She wasn't ready. She didn't want to do this anymore, but the weight of her choice felt insurmountable. As they arrived at the event, the usual rituals ensued. The cameras flashed. Reporters asked questions. Alex was charming, as always, his every move calculated for maximum impact. Charlotte stood beside him, smiling, nodding, playing the part. But inside, she was screaming. She excused herself for a moment, stepping away from the crowd. She needed air. The suffocating weight of it all was becoming unbearable. The cool night breeze hit her skin as she stepped out onto the balcony of the event venue. The city spread out before her, its lights flickering like 1,000 stars. Yet she felt more isolated than ever. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to be living this life. And yet, here she was. She didn't know how long she stood there, lost in her thoughts, until a voice interrupted her. "Couldn't take it either, huh?" Charlotte turned, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing in front of her, was Ethan. He looked as out of place as ever, his dark suit a contrast to the opulence around him. His eyes were warm, but there was something else in them, something understanding. "I didn't expect to see you here," Charlotte said, surprised by the flutter of nerves in her chest. Ethan shrugged with a casual grin. "I wasn't planning on it, but something told me you might need a break from all the pretense." Charlotte couldn't help but laugh, the sound light and genuine. "You're right. It's exhausting, isn't it?" "It's the part everyone expects us to play," Ethan said, stepping closer. "But it doesn't have to be real." Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. It was the same thing he had said to her at the gallery, but now it resonated deeper than ever. "You don't have to pretend, Charlotte," Ethan continued. "You're allowed to choose, to decide what kind of life you want to live. You don't owe anyone anything." Charlotte felt a lump form in her throat. She had never heard anyone speak to her like that. Like she mattered. Like her choices mattered. She had spent so long trying to live up to everyone else's expectations. But what if... She paused, unsure of how to finish the thought. What if she was making a huge mistake? What if she didn't have the courage to leave Alex, to leave everything she had built for herself? Ethan stepped closer, his eyes soft but unwavering. What if you finally gave yourself the chance to choose something real? Something that isn't just about appearances or status. Something that's truly yours. Charlotte felt a wave of emotion rise in her chest, threatening to spill over. She was so tired of pretending, of living for others, of being what everyone else expected her to be. "You deserve better than this," Ethan said, his voice low and sincere. "And so do I." Charlotte blinked back the tears that were threatening to spill. Her heart was racing, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a choice. She opened her mouth to speak, to tell Ethan that she didn't know what to do, but the words wouldn't come. She didn't know what the next step would be, but standing here, in front of Ethan, something inside her told her that she could make a choice, that she didn't have to live her life according to other people's rules. For once, she could choose herself. The days following her encounter with Ethan were a whirlwind of emotions that Charlotte couldn't quite sort through. Part of her felt an overwhelming sense of liberation, like she had stepped out from beneath the weight of the life she had been living. Another part of her felt fear gnawing at her, the reality of what it would mean to break away from everything she knew. The life she had been living wasn't hers. She knew that now. But walking away from Alex, from the world she had built around her, felt like stepping off a cliff. She hadn't seen Ethan since the gala. His words, though, had stayed with her. "You deserve better than this." It was a simple statement, but it had shaken something deep inside her. For the first time in a long time, Charlotte felt like she had permission to want something real. But what was that real thing? And could she afford to pursue it? The next evening, as Charlotte prepared for yet another public appearance with Alex, this time at a high-profile charity event, she found herself standing in front of the mirror, adjusting the straps of her gown. The diamonds around her neck sparkled in the light, but they only served to remind her of the cage she felt locked in. She had once thought that this life, the life Alex had offered her, would bring her happiness. But now, it only made her feel more isolated. She hadn't spoken to Alex about her feelings. She hadn't told him that their engagement no longer felt like a union, but a business contract. The thought of sitting down with him and confronting the truth terrified her. She wasn't sure how he would react. Would he try to convince her to stay? To fulfill the role he had carved out for her in his life? Or would he dismiss her concerns as irrelevant? As Charlotte finished adjusting her dress, her phone buzzed on the vanity. It was a message from her mother. Are you ready for the event? Don't forget, you need to look perfect. Remember, this is about securing your future. Alex is counting on you. Charlotte closed her eyes, the familiar pressure weighing on her chest. Alex is counting on you. Those words had followed her for as long as she could remember. She had never been allowed to forget that her life was not her own. She was the future Mrs. Montgomery, and her purpose was to stand by Alex's side, look beautiful, and support his business empire. But what about her own dreams? What about her own happiness? She shook the thought away, focusing instead on the upcoming event. There was no turning back now. She had to do this. She had to keep up the appearances. At the event, Charlotte found herself once again standing beside Alex, her arm linked through his as they smiled for the cameras. It was the same routine, another gala, another night of shaking hands with high-powered individuals, another night of pretending everything was perfect. But as the evening wore on, something shifted inside Charlotte. The weight of the evening, of the mask she had to wear, became unbearable. She couldn't stand the way Alex was always so distant. The way he saw her not as a partner, but as a tool to help him climb higher. He was always surrounded by others, always focused on the next business deal, the next event, and Charlotte was always there, standing by his side, a shadow in his world. As they moved through the crowd, Charlotte felt more and more disconnected from everything around her. She looked at the people talking and laughing, their voices rising in excitement over their successes, their wealth, and she realized how little she had in common with them. She didn't care about the power plays, the deals, the fame. She cared about something real, something human. And in that moment, it hit her. She wasn't just dissatisfied with her life, she was suffocating in it. She excused herself from Alex, telling him she needed some air. He barely noticed, as usual, his attention already shifting to the next conversation. Charlotte stepped outside into the cool night air, the city lights twinkling like distant stars. She walked out onto the balcony, leaning against the railing as she took in the view. The world seemed so vast, so full of possibilities. But here she was, trapped in a gilded cage of her own making. She had everything the world said she should want. Wealth, status, a successful fiancé, but it wasn't enough. It never had been. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to breathe, to just be for a second. That was when she heard a voice behind her. "Thought I might find you here." Charlotte turned, her heart skipping a beat. Ethan stood a few feet away, looking just as out of place as he had the last time they met. His dark suit was simple, but somehow, it made him stand out in a way that felt real. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice breathless. Ethan shrugged with a slight smile. "Had a feeling you might need a break from all this." Charlotte's heart twisted in her chest. She hadn't realized how much she had been craving someone who didn't see her as an object, a trophy, or a prop. Someone who simply saw her, Charlotte. "Yeah," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "I needed this." They stood there in silence for a moment, the cool breeze brushing against them. Charlotte felt an odd peace settle over her in his presence, the chaos of the night fading into the background. "I don't belong here, Ethan," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't belong in this world, in this life I've been living. I'm pretending that everything is fine when it isn't." Ethan stepped closer, his gaze soft but unwavering. "You don't have to pretend, Charlotte. Not anymore." Charlotte closed her eyes, the weight of her words sinking in. She had spent so long trying to live for everyone else, trying to be what Alex, her mother, the world wanted her to be. But none of that mattered. She didn't want to be someone else's version of perfect. She wanted to be herself. "I don't know how to walk away from it all," she said, her voice barely audible. "I don't know how to leave behind everything I've worked for." Ethan reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "You don't have to leave everything behind, but you do have to make a choice for yourself." Charlotte looked into his eyes, and for the first time, she saw something she hadn't seen in months. Hope, the possibility of a future that wasn't dictated by money or status, but by something real. "I don't know what the future holds," Charlotte whispered, "but I know I can't keep living this lie." Ethan smiled softly, his thumb brushing over her hand in a comforting gesture. "Then it's time to choose something real." For the first time in a long time, Charlotte felt like she had the power to choose. She didn't have to live for anyone else's expectations. She could live for herself. Charlotte spent the following days in a state of restless anticipation, Her encounter with Ethan had sparked something inside her, a flicker of hope, a sense of possibility. But with that hope came a realization that she couldn't ignore. She was still living a life that wasn't truly hers. She was still engaged to Alex, still playing the role of the perfect fiancé, smiling for the cameras and attending endless events that revolved around appearances. Every step she took felt like it was for someone else. Every choice was made for her. Every decision dictated by the world around her. But Ethan had made her see something she hadn't wanted to face for a long time. The life she had settled for wasn't enough. The charity gala was fast approaching, and Charlotte could feel the weight of the event bearing down on her. It was the first time she had to attend a high-profile event with Alex since their conversation on the balcony, and the tension between them was palpable. The press would be there, of course, waiting to snap pictures of the glamorous couple in their perfectly coordinated outfits, standing side by side in a show of unity. But Charlotte knew that the unity was a facade. It was a carefully curated image, a public display that didn't reflect the reality of their relationship. The more she thought about it, the more suffocating it all felt. She stood in front of her full-length mirror, gazing at the reflection staring back at her. The gown she wore was elegant, just like the countless others she had worn before, but this time, it felt heavy. The diamonds around her neck sparkled, but they only made her feel more distant from the woman she had once hoped to become. She wasn't ready. She wasn't ready to play the part anymore. She wasn't ready to be Alex's trophy wife, paraded around for the world to admire. And yet, here she was, preparing for the event, because that was what was expected of her. There was a knock on the door, and her mother's voice came from the other side. "Charlotte, darling, are you ready? The car is waiting." Charlotte took a deep breath and turned away from the mirror. "I'm coming," she called out. As she walked down the hallway, her thoughts were a whirlwind. She had promised herself that she would confront Alex soon, that she would tell him the truth. But how could she? How could she explain that the life she had built with him no longer felt like her own, that she was suffocating under the weight of it all? And how would he respond? Would he understand? Or would he dismiss her feelings as selfishness? The questions plagued her as they arrived at the event. The gala was everything she had come to expect from these high-profile social affairs. Lavish, extravagant, and cold. The guests mingled, the press crowded around, and the air was filled with the hum of business deals, public relations, and social climbing. Charlotte stood beside Alex, smiling for the cameras, answering questions from reporters, playing her part. But inside she felt a growing sense of isolation. It was as if she were watching someone else live her life. Alex, as usual, was the picture of control. His posture was perfect, his smile was flawless, and his every word was calculated to impress. But Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that he was miles away, even when he was standing right next to her. "I'll be right back," he said, giving her a quick glance before stepping away to speak with a group of businessmen. Charlotte stood there, alone, surrounded by people who didn't truly see her. The guests were polite but distant, each conversation a game of superficial pleasantries. She felt like a ghost, a mere accessory to the world Alex inhabited. She couldn't do this anymore. She couldn't live this life of illusion, of pretending to be someone she wasn't. Stepping away from the crowd, Charlotte found a quiet corner of the event hall, leaning against the wall and taking a deep breath. She needed a moment to herself, just a moment of clarity. The pressure of the event, the expectations from her mother, the expectations from Alex. It was all becoming too much. For a brief second, she allowed herself to think about the possibility of walking away. What if she left? What if she broke free from this suffocating world? What if she chose something real, something that wasn't dictated by wealth and status? She wasn't sure if she had the courage to follow through, but the thought of it felt like freedom, real freedom. "Charlotte?" She turned at the sound of her name and her heart skipped a beat when she saw Ethan standing in the doorway. He smiled at her, a warm, familiar smile that made her feel like she could breathe again. "I didn't expect to find you here." Charlotte's chest tightened as she met his gaze. She had spent the entire evening trying to escape the weight of her own life, trying to breathe in a world that wouldn't let her. But with Ethan here, standing in front of her, it was as if the world had slowed down. She didn't have to pretend. She didn't have to be someone she wasn't. "I needed a break," Charlotte said softly, her voice trembling. "It's a lot, you know?" Ethan nodded, his expression understanding. "I can imagine. You don't have to do this, Charlotte. You don't have to keep pretending. You can choose a different path." Her breath caught in her throat. His words were exactly what she had been thinking. What if she did choose a different path? What if she walked away from all of this? from the life Alex wanted for her, from the expectations that had been forced on her. Could she do it? Could she let go of everything and choose herself? "I don't know how," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if I have the strength to walk away." Ethan took a step closer, his eyes soft. "You don't have to do it alone." Charlotte felt a wave of emotion surge within her. Gratitude, fear, longing. She had spent so long trying to live up to other people's expectations, trying to be what Alex and her mother wanted her to be. But in this moment, standing with Ethan, she realized that she could make her own choices. She could live for herself. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaking. I needed to hear that." Ethan reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "You deserve more than this, Charlotte. You deserve a life that's yours, not one that's been given to you by someone else." Charlotte looked up at him, her heart racing. The moment felt electric, filled with a promise of something more, something real. For the first time, she felt like she had a choice. She wasn't trapped anymore. She could choose a different path. She could choose her path. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Charlotte knew what she had to do. The next morning, Charlotte stood at the edge of a decision. Her reflection in the mirror seemed like a stranger, someone who had been playing a role for so long that she had forgotten who she really was. The woman staring back at her wore a flawless gown, her hair styled to perfection. But beneath the surface, there was a battle raging inside her. For months, she had lived a life of pretense, a life dictated by expectations. Her mother's, Alex's, the public's. Every decision she had made had been shaped by the roles she was supposed to play. But now, standing on the precipice of change, Charlotte felt a surge of freedom, a freedom she hadn't felt in years. She had spent so long trying to fit into a life that didn't belong to her. But now, after everything, after her conversation with Ethan, after the events of the past week, she knew she couldn't keep pretending. She needed to leave. She needed to reclaim her life, her choices, and her happiness. The decision was hard. It wasn't something she could take lightly. Walking away from Alex and the life they had built together would mean facing the unknown. It would mean relinquishing the wealth, the security, the status she had become accustomed to. It would mean disappointing her mother, breaking the promises she had made, and shattering the perfect image that everyone had come to expect from her. But the life she had been living wasn't real. It was a carefully constructed illusion, and Charlotte knew now that she had to let it go. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she tapped out a message to Alex. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, but it was necessary. "I need to talk. It's time for us to face the truth. Meet me at the apartment." She hesitated before sending it, her heart pounding in her chest. The message was vague, but it was enough to set things in motion. She knew what she had to do. Now it was just a matter of making it happen. The later that afternoon, Charlotte paced the apartment, her thoughts racing. The silence in the space felt overwhelming, and every minute that ticked by made her feel more anxious. She had never been good at confrontation, never been able to speak her mind when it really mattered. But today, she knew she had to be strong. When the doorbell rang, Charlotte's heart leapt in her chest. Alex was here. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before she opened the door. Alex stood there, his face a mask of curiosity and concern. His expression softened when he saw her, though there was still that underlying tension, the ever-present distance between them. "Charlotte," he said, his voice low, almost too calm. "What's going on? Why did you ask to meet?" Charlotte looked into his eyes, her stomach twisting in knots. This was it. There was no going back. "I can't do this anymore, Alex," she said, her voice shaking, but firm. "I can't live this life that you've built for me. I don't want it. I never wanted it." Alex blinked, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "What are you talking about? We're engaged. We're building something together. You've always known what this was." "No," Charlotte interrupted, her voice rising with emotion. "I've always known what you wanted, Alex, but I've never asked myself what I want. And now I know. I want something real. I want love, not this facade, this life of power and appearances. I can't keep pretending." Alex's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Charlotte saw the flicker of something in his eyes. A flicker of anger, of hurt. He didn't understand. He couldn't. "Charlotte, you're being unreasonable," he said, his voice cold. "This is the life you've always wanted, the life you've always been a part of. You don't just walk away from it." "I'm not walking away from anything that matters," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I'm walking away from the lie, From the part of me that's been pretending to be someone I'm not. Alex took a step forward, his expression hardening. You think you can just walk away from this? From me? From everything we've built together? Charlotte shook her head. It was never ours, Alex. It was always yours. And I've been living in your world, not my own. There was a long silence between them, and Charlotte could see the realization begin to settle in. Alex wasn't angry now. He was hurt. And maybe that hurt was the truth. Maybe he had never really seen her, not for who she truly was. I'm sorry, Charlotte whispered, but I can't keep living this lie. Alex took a step back, his face unreadable. He didn't say anything for a long time, and for a moment, Charlotte wondered if he would try to change her mind. But then, with a resigned sigh, he turned and walked toward the door. Fine, he said, his voice barely audible. If that's what you want, then I can't stop you. Charlotte stood frozen as the door clicked shut behind him. The sound echoed through the empty apartment, and for the first time in a long time, Charlotte felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She had done it. She had taken control of her life, her choices, and her future. The doorbell rang again, and this time Charlotte's heart raced in anticipation. She knew who it was. She opened the door to find Ethan standing there, his familiar smile warming her heart. His presence was like a breath of fresh air in a room that had felt suffocating for far too long. You okay? He asked softly, stepping inside. Charlotte nodded, her eyes brimming with emotion. I think I finally made the right choice. Ethan smiled, his eyes filled with warmth and understanding. You did. Charlotte took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could finally be herself. She had chosen freedom, love, and honesty, and that, more than anything, felt like home. If you liked the video, subscribe to the channel. Your subscription will show that I'm on the right path to bring you the best videos ever. Check this video out too. This is Ethan, a once famous artist who vanished after losing everything, now living in the shadows of New York City. And this is Lila, a billionaire's daughter who spent $10,000 on his abandoned painting, without knowing the artist was homeless. What happens when their worlds collide? Will they create something extraordinary, or will it all fall apart again? I'm your host, Josh, and it's an absolute pleasure to share this story with you.